I just
sort
did
of
one episode for her.
Oh, you did? Okay, but that
Called
was
Complete Workout, which was
that was the first one, though, wasn't it?
No,
It wasn't. Okay.
it was the most successful one in her history.
Okay. Okay. But it was such a huge thing. I mean, direct-to-video type thing.
I think she made more money doing those videos than
The
any
movies,
pictures
really?
she ever made.
If we have time, I want to. I mean, there's a lot here to do, but at least I'd like to. Okay. All right, you left us in suspense there with the Petula Clark show. So Harry Belafonte was a guest on the show. What happened? What caused the controversy with Harry Belafonte and Petula Clark?
Well, I got a call from the sponsor and the network, NBC, and they said, unfortunately, the contract for Petula says that you have to have guest stars on the show. So we'll accept Belafonte, but you must put somebody else on the show with him. And I said, but the show is designed to just have Belafonte. So they submitted a list to me of people they recommended. And it was like Milton Berle, Ray Bolger, I remember those names specifically. And I said, no, they're not acceptable. So I was called to go to Detroit, Michigan to meet the president of Plymouth Cars. I went there, and now there was a big internal fight between the Detroit Young and Rubicon Agency and the New York Young and Rubicon Agency over who they were going to back. And they had a guy at Plymouth named Doyle Lott, who to me was a racist. I mean, he didn't want Belafonte because Belafonte was black, and he didn't want a black star on the show with Petula. And what had happened basically when I got the call from the Young and Rubicon guy that I thought was going to congratulate me for delivering Belafonte, he said, we have a problem. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, off the record, this guy, Doyle Lott, doesn't want Belafonte on the show. And I said, why? He said, well, on the record, it's because he doesn't think he's that popular anymore, and off the record, it's because he doesn't want a black man on the show. And I said, great. I said, if I'm forced to take Belafonte off the show, I will go on national television and quote you. He said, I'll call you right back. And he hung up. 2 minutes later, guy called, and he said, I've just replaced the guy you just spoke to, and you need to come to Detroit to plead your case. So I went to Detroit.
What did you do, or what did you say?
The guy from Plymouth was great. He was a car builder. He had nothing to do with show business, and he said to me basically, are you satisfied with Belafonte and the show concept? And I said, yes. Is Petula? And I said, absolutely. He said, we'll give you a decision. And I went back, and the decision was to go forward with the special. So then this Doyle Lott character said to me, congratulations, we're gonna win Emmys on this, and so forth and so on. Now we did the show, and we got to this Paths of Glory song. And originally I had staged it where it was after Harry had done his solo act, and then Petula enters from backstage, and she moves downstage and stops, and she's over his shoulder. And something wasn't working, and we did like 3 takes like that, and I finally said, stop. I went down, and I told Petula, next time you come out, go all the way up to Harry and stand alongside of him, which she did, and she immediately, emotionally, I could tell the two of them were really into the lyrics and what the song was saying, and she reached out and touched Harry's forearm, and I thought a herd of elephants had just left the client's booth. And Doyle Lott had gone bananas, bonkers, and he wanted this edited out of the show immediately. You'd thought they had fornicated on the air. So I immediately, when the show was over, the first call I got was from NBC's executive saying, whatever you're into, we're behind you, which was great to hear. So I went down to the editing room with Petula's husband, and we made the editor erase the first 3 takes. So the only take we had was that last take of them touching. And the editor at NBC was like shaking, and he made me sign a document giving him authority to do this as he erased the tapes.
So the show aired this way?
Show aired this way.
And what was the reaction?
I think everybody thought it was a publicity hoax, that they, it was like that's what they were complaining about, et cetera. But at the time, I mean, jobs were being, in jeopardy at the agency. It was an international incident picked up by Newsweek, Time magazine, big stories about it. Belafonte was going to run on The Tonight Show and tell all blacks not to buy Plymouth. The guy from Plymouth called me and said, please talk him out of it. We've done all these great charitable things. And it wasn't their fault at all. And they fired Doyle Lott. years later, I was in the South doing another special, and I read a headline from the Ku Klux Klan newspaper, which said, Jew producer fires, great American at Plymouth and so forth. And it was quite an experience. And I was so naive, I couldn't believe in 1967 this was still going on. But it was the first time a black and white had touched in primetime television.
Wow. So it seems almost quaint now, but at the time it must have been a huge thing. 1968, Elvis, a huge show in terms of television history. It's been recognized as one of the great shows musically and of a TV Guide and other, sort of surveys. How did that come to you, that Elvis special? I mean, just to give some backstory, he had just finished a whole series of movies in the 60s, right?
Correct.
And he hadn't really done live performances.
He'd not been in front of an audience, a live audience, for years.
So I imagine that came to you because of your music background, but how did you approach that assignment?
Well, good things happen when you stand up for things. I got it because of the incident with Petula Clark and Harry Belafonte. I got a call from Bob Finkel, who is a major variety producer. Bob called me and said that Colonel Parker and Tom Sarnoff had signed a contract to do an Elvis Presley special. He was assigned to produce it, and he was having problems. He could never get through to Elvis to get him to actually do the show. And he said he even won't call me Bob, he calls me Mr. Finkel. And I need somebody who sort of can speak his language and who he can trust. And would you come in and produce and direct Elvis? I'll executive produce it. And I said no. I was not a great Elvis Presley fan at the time. I was amused by his appearances on Ed Sullivan and Steve Allen and so forth. But, at that time, I had a production company with a very talented producer named Bones Howe. And we were producing The Fifth Dimension, The Association, Laura Nero. And Bones had engineered some record sessions with Elvis and said, Steve, you're crazy. You and Elvis will be great friends. You'll hit it off. So I agreed to a meeting with Elvis to see if we could be compatible. And Elvis came to our offices next to Tower Records on Sunset, and we had our offices in the glass elevator building on Sunset Boulevard. And he came over one afternoon with the Colonel and an entourage, and Elvis came into the room without Colonel Parker, without the entourage, and in the meeting was Alan Bly, the writer, and at that time he and Mason had split, and he was now partners with Chris Beard, another crazy, talented producer-writer, and Bones and myself. And we didn't talk about the special at all. We just talked about the music business. We were dealing a lot with Jimmy Webb at the time, and I said, hey, if I brought you MacArthur Park instead of giving it to Richard Harris or something, would you have recorded it? And Elvis said, absolutely. And I thought, hey, this isn't a guy who's living in the past. It's a guy who really wants to say something. And I said, well, let's do this. He was going to Hawaii to chill out and, get in shape, so to speak. And he said that when I get back, why don't you prepare a show for me, and then I'll see if I like it and see if I want to do it. And that was all we talked about the show. He took off. We bought all of his records, his 33 1/3 records, and we designed the Elvis Presley special. He came back from Hawaii. We went back into the office, and he listened to the pitch, and he said, when do we start? It was that simple. And I said, don't you have anything that you don't like or it's negative? He said, no, it sounds great. Let's do it.
What was the idea for the show? I mean, in terms of what was radical about it, or really maybe experimental?
First of all, it was the first time in national network primetime television that one man did the whole show by himself with no guest stars. That was a hard hurdle. It's the first time that NBC's staff orchestra was not used. They were all hand-picked rock and roll musicians in the orchestra. And the concept was, basically, it was all out of Elvis Presley's music. It was wall-to-wall bits and pieces and songs, except for the final song, If I Can Dream, which there were two original songs that were became #1 records off the special. One was Memories, and the other was If I Can Dream. But it was basically to tell the story of the Bluebird, somebody who starts as an unknown guitar man in a small town anywhere in America, and works his way up to this amazing success, fame, and fortune, and realizes that happiness is being back home without all the show business and glitter and so forth. That was really the thread that was never stated, but was the underlying thread for the whole special.
Now, Colonel Parker had a different idea, didn't he? I mean, did you have a conflict with him about this, the vision for this show?
Well, the mandate was that Elvis doesn't talk on national television, and he do a Christmas song. And the Colonel gave me a Christmas album, which they sent to disc jockeys all over America, which basically was a fake interview where the disc jockey could pretend he was there live in the radio booth and ask him questions, and he would answer. And it was all programmed, and then they were just records that were played. And I never had a concept of doing that, and the Colonel and I definitely butted heads. But I also recognized that the Colonel could have pulled the plug whenever he wanted to. He had that kind of power, and certainly NBC wasn't willing to defy Colonel Parker in those days. But I think the reason the show proceeded, the reason the show actually happened, the reason it aired is because deep down the Colonel realized that there was something special going on that would be a benefit to his artists. And truthfully, when I did the show, I was no different doing an Elvis Presley special than I was with anybody else I had worked for. It was just doing 100% of the best work you can do for an artist, and not thinking about, is it going to be successful, isn't it going to be successful, and so forth. It was a real marriage of talented people coming together. And I believe the television medium is built around teamwork, not one person. And I had a fabulous team surrounding me, and it changed Elvis's musical direction. He had never, ever recorded, which I wasn't even aware of, with anything but a rhythm section up until that point. And when I brought in Billy Goldenberg and fired Billy Strange because he was more involved in Nancy Sinatra's career than Elvis, the Colonel thought the whole thing was going to fall apart, but Elvis went along with every decision that I made, trusted me, and we just had a great experience.
Was there an immediate reaction to the show? I mean, the next day, what was being said about it?
He was back on top, period. I mean, it was an explosion. And
did you
nobody
think about
expected
that?
it.
Was that something you thought might be a result of this? I mean, kind of taking him back to the roots as opposed to that slick Elvis kind of image. Was that sort of part of the conscious effort, the conscious purpose of your vision for this show?
Well, you have to realize I'm kind of an off-the-cuff kind of guy, and what I saw of Elvis off-camera is what I wanted to translate on camera. I thought Elvis had a great sense of humor. I thought Elvis, If I Can Dream, was tailor-made. I knew I couldn't get a speech out of him, so we wrote the lyrics to say that, there's got to be a land where brotherly love is important, and so forth. And these were things Elvis actually expressed. We were there together in rehearsals when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, the ambassador. Found out that Elvis was really into the whole, Martin Luther King, John Kennedy assassinations. Showed all kinds of, humanitarian aspects, and I thought, geez, the public should know about all this, et cetera. And then when I saw him after we'd be rehearsing the planned program and taping all day at NBC, and Elvis lived at NBC, and one of the big dressing rooms was converted to his living quarters. And after a strenuous day of recording, he'd go into the dressing room and unwind improvisationally, playing for hours with his guys. And I wanted to go in with a handheld camera and shoot that. And I remember distinctly when the Colonel finally acquiesced to letting me recreate the improv out on stage. I remember a couple of things. One is that when it came time to do it, Elvis chickened out and didn't want to do it. I kind of literally forced him to go out there, and he said, what if I can't think of anything to say or sing? I said, then say goodnight and come back, but you got to go out there. Well, once he was out there, it was over. I mean, it was history. And the other thing is that in planning the show, I realized that what was really powerful was the improv. And when NBC saw the special, their comments originally were, hey, you can't show that on television. You can see sweat under his armpits. You can see his hair all mussed up in his face. And I'm saying, this is the gold. This is what's going to turn the audience on. And fortunately, they let me at least put portions of it in the NBC broadcast.
Very briefly, why do you think that show is still looked at as one of the best music shows that ever aired in television history?
Just because of its honesty. It wasn't pretentious. It wasn't trying to say something. You know, I think deep down, because I believe in the subliminal, I believe in the, you know, when you direct, you don't direct the words, you direct the subtext. And I think that had an honesty to it that people got to see his soul. They got to see him as he really is.
Let's go through just some shows that you were involved with, just briefly, and tell me what you think the impact of the show was and what the experience was for you in terms of just something that might be different along the path of your career. 1973, Don Kirshner's rock concert.
Well, I met a very talented producer, Phil Spector, who was really famous for his wall of sound, and he told me about Don Kirshner, wanted me to come to New York to meet him and so forth, and he was launching a syndicated show called Rock Concert. I went there, and there wasn't a lot of chemistry between us, but Don said, if you'll do this show, you have a free hand. You can do anything you want to. And I was tired of, television was kind of put in a box in those days where the artist would be told, you know, you walk up to that T mark on the floor and that's where the front light is and the back light, and then you know, in the middle of the song you walk over to the other T mark and there'd be another backlight and front light and everything. I wanted to free the artist. That's what I did with Elvis Presley in the boxing ring. I did that later on with Patti LaBelle in her special, where I just said, don't worry that we're filming, just do your thing, you know. And so I decided that all these music shows, rock and roll shows specifically, where the artist would be booked, they were told they would have 2 songs, you know, they had to be 2 minutes long or whatever. And I thought on Rock Concert, let's just let them do their act, and then we'll edit the 6 minutes or the 8 minutes that they're allowed in the show, and we'll find the moments to put into that. And that was the concept of Rock Concert. So every act that performed in the show literally was not restricted to a time limitation or where they could stand and so forth. And I think that was my contribution to that show.
And did you stay with that show for a long time?
No, I was working around the clock, killing myself, you know, because what I didn't realize, which I always never realize, is how much work it is to go into post-production and edit tons of hours and material and tone it down. And one night at 4:30 in the morning, I was on Vine Street at the editing facility, and I got a call from Don Kirshner in New York, and it was 7:30 his time. And he said, Steve, the sponsors are threatening to pull out of the show because they can't read my name in the bumpers. And I was exhausted. I said, Don, I have a solution. He said, what is it? I said, why don't you get on a plane and come out here and fix it yourself? And he said, are you threatening me to walk off the show? And I said, no, I wasn't thinking about it then, but the answer is yes. And I hung up the phone and walked out. And that was the last time I ever saw Don Kirshner or did any more rock concerts.
1977, there was a mime act, Shields and Yarnell. Tell me about that show.
Well, Lorene Yarnell was one of the top, you know, chorus dancers in town, and she worked on the Elvis Presley special in what they call the bordello sequence. And she called me up one day and said, I've fallen in love with this young mime who used to stand in front of the Hollywood Wax Museum, and then he's been in San Francisco doing street mime, and we decided to team up. So, and I'm going to marry him. And would you come to Las Vegas and see our act? They were in a show that was called the Doodah Gang, and they had a little vaudevillian segment in the show, eating breakfast as robots. And I fell in love with the act. I thought they were great, so I became their manager, and then I produced and directed them, and I was producing and directing Mac Davis on NBC, a series and some specials. And Mac, as a joke, knowing my involvement with Shields and Yarnell, would always give them this incredible 30-second introduction, which like they were, the most wonderful, artists, et cetera, on television. And he went out of his way to be complimentary to them, and America heard all this. Next thing, we got an offer to do a CBS series, and we ended up going on in the summer. We were in the top 5 shows in America, and then we went off the air at the end of the summer, and then we were offered to go on network television in the fall because of their success on CBS, and I got a call saying, you got this offer, and so forth and so on. I said, who are we up against? And they said, well, that's the problem, but don't worry about it, because if they just do as well as the show that preceded them, they'll be big heroes. And I said, what's the show? And they said, Laverne and Shirley, which is the #1 show in America. I said, I don't want to take the slot, because they'll end up being in the bottom 10 when the show airs. And everybody said, no, you're crazy, you got to take it. CBS will never put you on the air again if you don't take it now. And unfortunately, they got to Shields and Yarnell, and Shields and Yarnell said, you can't do this to us, Steve. We got to do this show. It's our great, big opportunity. And I advised against it, and we did it. We did the same show we did in the summer. It was even better than we did in the summer. They were in the bottom 10 or the bottom 5, and that was the last of their network television experience.
Wow. Also, the same year, Barry Manilow did his first television special. How did that come to you?
I got a call from Barry asking if I would come to New York and meet him. He was interviewing producers and directors. And I flew to New York, got there, and he said, gee, I'm really sorry I brought you to New York, because I've made up my mind. I've hired a director already. And I said, okay. He said, I'm recording tonight. If you have any interest, you might drop over to the recording studio. And so I did. I went over to the recording studio, and I watched him record, and we talked a little bit and so forth. Got on the plane the next day, flew back to Los Angeles, and I got a call from Barry saying, I fired the guy that I hired, and I want you to produce and direct my special. That's how I got the job. Then Barry at that time only had really one big record, and the record was Mandy.
And what did you do at that rehearsal or that recording session that turned him around?
No, other than I spoke his language musically, because I was in the record business as well as the television business. But I didn't do anything to talk myself into the job. I'd already convinced myself it was a wasted trip. Came back, and I said, basically, again, let's create this one and only special for you, and so forth, which we did. We shot the show in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The home base of the show was Ravinia Park in Chicago, and then we did these production segments elsewhere. TV Guide wasn't even willing to put any blurbs about the show, because they considered that Barry was, not a television personality, etc. We were going up that year against Carol Burnett and Julie Andrews at the Met. Neil Diamond was doing a big special at the Greek Theater. There was a wonderful magician, Doug Henning, who was really hot at the time. So nobody paid any attention to us. And we shot the show. And I had an idea. What I wanted to do was not stop and start songs. I wanted to do parts of the songs in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles. So it was pretty complicated, putting all the keys in the right key and so forth. And we do 16 bars in New York, and another 16 in Chicago, another 16 in LA. And so it was a lot of fun putting it together. And finished the show, went to work on another special, and I got a call from Miles Laurie, Barry's manager. He said, you got to come to New York immediately. They hate the show, and they want to bring Dick Clark in to redo it. And if you want to save your show, you got to get on a plane and come to New York. And I did. I took the red eye out that night. Went to New York, met all the executives at ABC, and I told them that I wouldn't be a part of doing anything to change the show. And they financed it. It's their show. If they wanted to bring Dick Clark in, they could do anything they wanted to, but I was not going to be a part of it. And so they said, well, let's look at the show again and tell you what we think about it. And they looked at the show, and I'd never made any changes whatsoever. And they all, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and they all said, gee, you've made a lot of changes to this show. It isn't as bad as we thought it was, and so forth. I didn't say anything, and they agreed to air it. Well, the show got 7 Emmy nominations, and we won Best Variety Show of the Year special. And then I got all these congratulatory letters from all the guys who I met in New York, et cetera. And and then at the Emmys, when I was getting up in my seat to receive the Emmy, Barry Manilow's agent leaned over to me and he said, "Steve, I should tell you now, but Barry's hired another director to do his next special." I said, "Fine." And I did do one other Barry Manilow special years later called Big Fun on Swing Street. So we ended up in a good relationship. But that's show business. I mean, I had no...
Now, you got an Emmy for directing that show, too, is that right?
No, only for Best Show of the Year.
Oh, Best Show of the Year.
I lost out in the directing.
Okay. But at the time, I was going to ask you, during the time you went to New York to sort of defend, or actually to declare that you were not going to change the show, where did Barry stand in all this? Did he weigh in at all? Or?
I didn't see Barry being active in it. He was going to go along with what ABC said. I mean, I never heard him as a staunch defender, but I know when he finished his next special with a very, very fine director, he wrote me saying he never appreciated how great the first special was until his next experience. And then he asked me to come back and do another one.
Well, that must have been a nice letter to get then.
Yeah.
Speaking of Emmys, you were involved producing the Emmy Awards telecast for several years.
I produced and directed the Emmys for 4 years.
Now, how did that come about? You've been known for directing specials and music, certainly, but this is a whole kind of different ballgame, the award shows.
Well, I'd been offered the Emmys previous to that, I think in the Bob Banner days, and I'd never wanted to do award shows. In fact, I have a big problem with award shows now because I think who wins the Emmys are the shows that are supposed to be awarding the great shows for the Emmys. Instead, they give it to the Emmy award shows. But Gary Smith from Hullabaloo and Dwight Hemian, who were really premier producer, director. I think Dwight is, I've always admired Dwight. We've had interesting careers because he was the original Steve Allen director before I did the Westinghouse Show. And they called and said, "We want to executive produce the Emmys, and we'd love you to come in and produce and direct them." So I did for 4 years. And I loved it. It was a great experience. I think one quick great story on the Emmys is I think the third year, there was an executive at CBS, Fred Rappaport. And Fred was very supportive of anybody working for him, but very nervous. And I was directing the Emmys, and in the control booth before the show started, I was always go out and just meditate for 2 minutes by myself and take deep breaths and so forth, and then go in. My script book was about yay big and 500 shots and so forth. And I walked in the control booth, and it's a minute before air and no script book. And the opening number was the choreographers choreograph the choreographers. It was a huge production number with dance numbers with 5 different choreographers, 200 camera shots and so forth. And my book's not there. And I was like freaking out. And what happened is about 10 seconds before we went live nationally, Fred Rappaport had picked up my script thinking it was his and walked out of the control booth. And luckily somebody caught him and ran back in with my script. And I literally turned the page to the first shot, and we were on the air.
Okay. Let's change tape and pick up after that.